Hello again, and welcome to another in a series of online video lessons intended to provide you important principles and handy tips to develop your understanding and experience with public speaking. In this lesson, we're going to look at the absolutely important element of audience analysis, part of the invention process of your public speech that is ignored by public speakers at their peril. In this video lesson, we'll talk a bit about why audience analysis is so important, examine the crucial element of establishing common ground with your audience, consider how the situational characteristics in your speaking context need to be taken into consideration, think about how audience demographic variables are crucial to establishing common ground, briefly consider the importance of prior exposure and disposition to mindsets your audience will bring with them to the public speaking context, and finally, mention why gathering audience information is an important step that you shouldn't ignore, and provide a couple of means of doing that. But what is all of this really all about? In brief, it's about avoiding this.
In 1930, the Republican-controlled House of Representatives, in an effort to alleviate the effects of the, anyone? The Great Depression, passed the, anyone? A tariff bill, the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act, which anyone raised or lowered, raised tariffs in an effort to collect more revenue for the federal government. Did it work? Anyone? Anyone know the effects? It did not work, and the United States sank deeper into the Great Depression. Today, we have a similar debate over this. Anyone know what this is, class? Anyone? Anyone? Anyone seen this before? The Laffer curve. Anyone know what this says? It says that at this point on the revenue curve, you will get exactly the same amount of revenue as at this point. This is very controversial. Does anyone know what Vice President Bush called this in 1980? Anyone? Something DOO economics. Voodoo economics.
Whether you're facing a room full of classmates, a committee of coworkers at your workplace, members of a board or a city organization at a public hearing, public speaking requires that you have an audience that pays attention to you and is at least marginally interested in what you're talking about. So this is what we want to avoid. We'd rather have a situation like this, where the audience is engaged, paying attention, and thinking favorably about what you have to say. So why is it that we do audience analysis? Well, because tailoring your message to your audience means three important things: greater audience interest, they'll actually want to hear what you have to say; improved speaker ethos or credibility, in other words, your audience will feel better about you as a speaker and be more apt to trust you; and finally, a more receptive audience. In other words, not only will they pay attention, but they'll take your message more seriously and they may think about it afterwards. So, what this is ultimately about is establishing common ground with your audience. Frawley and Tuman define common ground pretty simply as beliefs, values, and experiences that you share with your listeners. One place that I do part company with the authors of the Speak Up public speaking text is that they examine common ground as a form of audience analysis, something where you try to figure out what the beliefs, values, and experiences of your listeners are. And that is absolutely true. But I think it's more valuable to think about common ground as a more fundamental element of any successful communication. Rhetorical theorist Kenneth Burke describes the process of identification as a prerequisite to communication. If you're going to effectively inform, or especially if you're going to effectively persuade your audience, you need to establish identification first. What does that mean? Consider the situation. We have a politician running for office, and we have an audience filled with potential supporters and potential opponents. Now, in any communication situation, both speaker and audience will have what Burke calls substance, literally the ground that you stand upon. And for Burke, that means things like knowledge, experience, history, beliefs, values, attitudes, the language that we use, and so forth. Substance makes humans as individual as a fingerprint or a retina scan. So in this situation, how is it that communication is possible? Well, for Burke, what that means is transcending the differences between the individuals through establishing what he calls consubstantiality. basically a fancy word for common ground or shared substance. We transcend what makes us different by figuring out literally what makes us the same. What sort of knowledge, experience, beliefs, values, attitudes, uses of language, etc. do we share? If we can establish those things, then we can have successful communication. And so what audience analysis is all about is trying to figure out who your audience is so that you can achieve this common ground. To establish that common ground, one of the things you need to analyze are the situational characteristics of your speaking context. Fraley and Tuman describe this as the factors in a specific speech setting that you can observe or discover before you give the speech. Because when and where and under what circumstances you're speaking can have a huge impact. So for instance, two separate but potentially related variables in the situation are the size of your audience and the location or the forum of where you're speaking. Think about it. If you're speaking to a relatively small audience around a table, say at a business pitch, that's going to affect the ways in which you speak. You're going to be much more interactive, potentially open to questions and answers, and the way that you present yourself is going to be different than, say, if you were presenting yourself in a public speech in front of a larger classroom of 20 to 30 students that are going to be a bit more passive, and there's going to be more of them that potentially are a captive audience, and you need to think about why they're there and how you're going to grab them. And this size of an audience and this location is certainly different than if you're speaking in an auditorium before a huge audience, many of which are there because they want to hear you speak. And so everything from the size to the diversity of the audience within such a large group, the smallness of the room rather than the largeness of the room, the way that acoustics operate, the way that technology might or might not come into play and how you have to deliver, all of these things are important variables because they're going to affect what you say and how you say it. Similarly, think about the time in which you're presenting. For instance, the presentation itself can have time constraints. If you're going to be delivering a relatively short speech, then you need to think about the kinds of things you can do and what you can't do. You're not going to be able to go into a lot of specific detail and present a large volume of information. You're going to have to be very selective about what you say and how you say it. Keep the best, dump the rest. Keep the pace simple and keep the topic focused. Now, if you're delivering a longer speech, you've got a bit more latitude with regard to the amount of things that you can talk about. However, at the same time, you're also going to be potentially taxing the audience's ability to keep attention. So you're going to have to think about things such as, how do I maintain the audience's attention and interest throughout the speech? And also, how do I make sure that I stay on message and don't allow the longer speaking time to result in digression and getting off track? Another important element of time is the body clock of your audience, because let's face it, some times to deliver speeches are much more conducive than others. It's very possible you'll get an audience like this, and there's a lot of reasons that might happen. Maybe it's really early in the morning. Maybe it's the very end of the afternoon when coworkers or students are really tired, they've done a lot of work that day, and they're really ready to just be done. Maybe it's right before a meal and folks are hungry. Maybe it's right after a big lunch and folks are feeling sedentary. There's different times in which physiologically our bodies are awake and alert and able to pay attention. And sometimes it's more difficult. So as a speaker, you need to be able to gauge this and figure out, well, if I've got a more physiologically disengaged audience, what kinds of things can I do to perk them up and help them pay attention? And finally, Fraley and Tuman suggest we also think about audience mobility. Now, what does this mean? Well, there's different kinds of public speaking situations regarding what sort of flexibility your audience has to listen or not. In many situations, you're going to have a stationary audience. The audience is there to hear a presentation, and the room is set up in such a way that once they sit down, they're really not going to be getting up for the most part until the presentation is over. However, it's often the case that you might be presenting when you have a mobile audience. For instance, a poster presentation at a conference where folks are going to be milling around and they can stop and listen to you or not listen to you as they feel like it. There's the possibility that they can come by for a couple of minutes and then take off. So what you say and how you say it when you have to attract the audience to you in the first place and then keep them there when they can get up and leave whenever they want to is a different sort of situation than when you have a captive audience. So, in short, you need to think about the situational variables because they're going to affect how your audience receives the speaking situation. And that then is going to affect how you determine what you say and how you say it. Another important area to think about is audience demographics. In brief, demographics refer to population data, information that tells us about a group of people in broad observable terms. Frowley and Tuman provide the definition that it involves certain characteristics of your listeners, including age, gender composition, sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, religious orientation, socioeconomic background, and political affiliation. And these are important variables to consider because depending on your audience, for instance, a variable such as age might have connections to certain patterns of beliefs and experiences, such as relative familiarity with popular culture or historical, political, or social references. Areas like gender and sexual orientation can potentially be important depending on the topic and the way that you make certain appeals based on that topic. In some situations, you can make some relatively accurate, educated guesses regarding how an audience is going to respond if they primarily identify as male or female, masculine or feminine in terms of constructed gender norms. However, at the same time, you also run the risk of stereotyping if you make unwarranted assumptions about what women are supposed to believe or act like, or assuming that everybody in an audience is straight when you may have folks that are gay, lesbian, or bisexual. You can't make assumptions necessarily regarding gender, given the very real possibility of having transgendered folks in your audience. So on the one hand, thinking about gender is going to be important because certain genders and certain sexual orientations will have particular ways of perceiving certain topics. At the same time, you don't want to fall into mistaken assumptions and stereotypes. The same is going to be true of race and ethnicity. If you have members of the audience that are of a different race or a different ethnicity, it's very likely that some of their beliefs, attitudes, particularly their life experiences and cultural perceptions, are going to be very different than those of the majority of your audience. And so you need to take this into account, not just because you want to reach these folks and so potentially make direct appeals to the kind of experiences that are important to them, but at the same time, you can't make overall broad assumptions. You can't just assume that everybody experiences life in our society or culture the same way as you might if you're a member of the majority culture. Similarly, you can't just make assumptions that just because someone is of a different race or of a different ethnic background, that they are necessarily going to believe or think a certain way. So it's a balancing act, and being able to identify with the experiences and perceptions of a culturally diverse audience is going to be really important. Religion operates in a similar way. Depending on the topic that you're discussing, whether or not your audience has a particular faith tradition or whether they have faith in any kind of religious presence at all may make a difference depending on the kind of value and attitude appeals you might need to make in your speech. And you can't just assume that everybody is going to have the same kind of belief structure as you do. So you need to be sensitive to religious diversity. Socioeconomics can play a really important role as well. Things like social class, the occupations of the folks in the room, the level of education that they have, all of these can have a really important impact on how we experience day-to-day life in our society and culture. And so you need to be aware of this and not just assume that everybody has the same cultural experiences. Political affiliation, depending on the topic, again, may be something you need to think about. If your audience is primarily conservative or liberal, Republican or Democrat, or a different sort of affiliation, maybe they are moderate centrists who don't affiliate with a party. Depending on the way they think about politics, certain topics need to be discussed in ways that are going to appeal to them. And if you have a politically diverse audience, you need to walk that tightrope between what kinds of things are the more liberal or more democratic leaning folks going to consider important, what kinds of things are the more conservative or more Republican leaning folks going to consider important. As you can imagine, if you're walking into a place where you've got a relatively diverse audience, you need to engage in a balancing act. And given the importance of all of these variables, you'll want to gather information about these demographics as carefully as you can. And we'll talk about that just a bit later. Besides demographics, who your audience is, thinking about specific experiences that they've had relative to your topic is important. And one of those is prior exposure. This can cut both ways. For instance, if you're delivering a message that is just the same as folks have heard before, knowing whether or not the audience has been exposed to, may have already heard your message, is going to be crucial. Because if you just say the same old thing that they've heard time and time again, they're going to be bored and disengaged, and they can't really attend to your message. And so you need to think about ways that you might be able to get at the kinds of things that you want to talk about without boring them, providing some sort of new angle to the thing that they've heard before. On the other hand, if your audience has had no prior exposure to your message, you have the advantage of being able to present them something new and different. However, you're going to have to not make as many assumptions about what they already know or already believe. You may need to lay down some more fundamental groundwork on your topic to get them up to speed so they understand what you're ultimately getting at. When thinking about prior exposure, there's three primary questions you want to ask then. First, has my audience heard this message before? Because if they have heard it or not, it's going to make a difference. Secondly, if they have heard the message before, has the audience responded positively to the message? If they have responded positively to the message, that's going to lead you to want to do certain sorts of things that you might not otherwise do if they haven't. So if they have not responded positively to the message before, you'll want to try to determine why the previous message failed, because you won't want to do that. If your audience has been exposed to the message previously, you need to think about what is it that they're going to want to hear, what kinds of things are they not going to want to hear. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean you tell audiences just what they want to hear. Sometimes you have to tell audiences something that they may not care for. But if that's the case, you need to figure out ways in which you can do that that are going to connect. That leads, of course, to a closely related yet distinct idea, which is audience disposition. Depending on your topic, your audience is going to come into the room predisposed one way or another toward the thing that you're talking about. So audience disposition, briefly defined, is the audience's likely attitude toward your message. And there's at least three primary approaches to audience disposition. You can have a sympathetic audience. In other words, an audience that's predisposed favorably to your topic. This is a pretty good position to be in, because if you select a topic or you're taking a position that your audience is sympathetic toward, then they're going to be receptive, at least initially, to the things that you have to say. So that being said, you don't want to bore them by trying to, for instance, persuade them to take your point of view if they already have your point of view. You'll want to take a different tactic. Are there ways that you can boost their commitment? Are there ways that you can take their favorable attitude and translate that into some form of action? Now, of course, on the other hand, you can walk into a hostile audience, an audience that's resistant to the message that you're providing. And it is probably inevitable that at some point in your public speaking career, you're going to need to say something to an audience that they're not going to like and they don't want to hear. So this means that you're going to need to try to figure out how to establish that common ground so that you can lay the groundwork for your position in a way that your audience will at least be open to. Sometimes the best result that you can get in a public speech for a hostile audience is getting your audience to come away at the end of the event with, well, I still don't agree with you, but you made some good points and it's something I need to think about. That may be as far as you get, and that can be a success. And then, of course, there's neutral audiences, audiences that aren't necessarily committed one way or another toward the message that you want to present. Now, on the one hand, this can be helpful because if they're coming in without a predisposition, then you have a good opportunity to establish a frame of reference for them, a way that they can think about this issue or this topic when they come across it in the future. On the other hand, there's a couple of different reasons they could be neutral. Part of it might be they're just not informed about it, and so then you're going to need to establish more basic information to get them up to speed on the topic before they can have a positive or negative attitude in the first place. Another reason audiences might be neutral is a little bit trickier, and that's because they're apathetic. They don't care. They don't think it's a big deal. And so if that's the case, you need to think about how to establish common ground with your audience to establish that, well, actually it is a big deal for you, and here's why. So in brief, thinking about audience disposition is going to have a big impact on how you frame your topic and what sort of strategies you use to inform or persuade them. It's going to have an impact on the kind of outcome that you shoot for in your specific rhetorical purpose. And so you want to try to figure out that disposition in advance. So this leads ultimately to gathering audience information. If there's any lesson you should have gleaned at this point, it's that there's lots of things about your audience that you really want to know before you start preparing that speech and presenting it. So Frawley and Tuman talk about a few different ways you can do this. Surveys, for instance, are a great way to gather a large amount of information about your audience relatively simply. Surveys can be especially helpful for gathering demographic information and perhaps very simple disposition or prior exposure information. Have you heard about this or not? How do you feel about this topic? Positive, negative, undecided. If you have the opportunity to distribute surveys in advance, that can be a great way to get this kind of information. Depending on the audience and depending on the topic, you might want to interview some of the folks that are in your audience, perhaps individually or as a small focus group, and sounding them out, asking them some questions about how they feel about this topic. Sometimes in a conversational interview, you can get information from audience members that you can't just get if you're taking a true or false or multiple choice survey. And then, of course, there's the possibility, if you can't do surveys and or you can't do interviews, of what Frawley and Tuman refer to as indirect observation. You may just have to think critically and make some educated guesses about the audience based on who they are. If you're delivering a speech before a college class, for instance, you can make some guesses about their age, their relative life experiences on campus, and the kinds of things that they do academically and co-curricularly. Co-curricularly, is that a word? Well, it is now. There's going to be an assumption that in that kind of classroom there may be a diversity of political opinions and cultural and religious backgrounds. On the other hand, if you're delivering a speech before a very specific organization, say the Parent-Teacher Association at a local grade school, you can make other kinds of assumptions. The fact that they're older, the fact that they're parents, the fact that they're very involved in their kids' education, and that informs a lot of what they do. So the audience composition itself may give you some grounds for making pretty good inferences about who they are and what they believe. And then, of course, there is the all-important reality of situational analysis. One must absolutely observe audience feedback while the speech is in progress. While you're delivering the speech, you need to remember that public speaking is not just a one-way flow of information, but it's a transaction. It's a feedback loop. And all the time that you're speaking, your audience is going to be providing you with nonverbal cues and clues. Are they establishing eye contact with you? Are they smiling and nodding? Are they nodding off? Are they texting? Are they sleeping? Are they throwing you the stink eye? You need to pay attention to these sorts of things, because if your audience is giving you positive nonverbal feedback, whatever you're doing, it's working, and you should keep that up. However, if you notice that your audience seems confused or unsure about what you're talking about, you may need to change things up, slow down a little bit, and maybe re-describe a point in more concrete terms. If you happen to notice that your audience seems to be really unreceptive to what you're talking about, maybe they're hostile, you may need to think about how you reframe your points in order to reestablish the common ground. And if your audience seems to be just drifting, you may need to figure out a way that you can grab their attention again and maintain it. And so if you're not paying attention to the audience, you can't do any of these things. So on-the-spot situational analysis is crucial. So in this lesson, we've considered the importance of the audience to the public speaking situation and thought specifically about particular ways you want to analyze your audience in order to prepare and present your speech most effectively. We've emphasized the point that really can't be emphasized enough, that audience analysis is vital for establishing identification with your audience through establishing common ground. Given the differences between yourself and your listeners, what kinds of things about you are the same? What sorts of experiences, knowledge, beliefs, values, attitudes, principles, priorities? What do you share? What makes you the same? And in order to figure that out, you need to think about, for instance, the situation that you find yourself in. What is the size of your audience, the location, whether or not your audience is mobile or immobile, the time that you're presenting your speech, and what does that mean for your audience? You can't skip this step. Thinking about who your audience is in terms of demographic information, their prior exposure to your message, and whether or not they have a favorable or unfavorable predisposition to what you're talking about can all provide you important information that will guide how you invent your speech. And finally, given all of this, gathering audience information before the speech and during the speech, during your on-the-spot analysis of your audience, is absolutely vital. Okay, so if you've got any questions at all about this really important set of principles for understanding and adapting to your audience, please don't hesitate to reach out. Otherwise, I'll see you next time.